Hello, thank you, Sarah. It's nice to be with you all. Lovely to be invited into your community here. Um, Before I kind of talk about the topic, I thought I'd just do a brief intro of myself so you know a little bit more about who I am and my background. So I'm a strategic designer that works at the intersection of design, leadership, and learning. And I deliver consulting, facilitation, leader development, program design, and coaching services to people who are themselves either design practitioners or leading change processes or are consultancies that are delivering those types of services. This includes my working directly with private enterprise and the public sector. I have a background in education and working in the health sector with leadership teams. So yeah, I'm familiar with this territory. I also am the founder of a 9-week learning lab called Transition Leadership Lab. And it's for practitioners who are wanting to enhance and develop their own self-leadership so that they can lead with others more wisely in a world that is in constant flux right now. So it is around self-leadership, but it's in service to then being able to lead with other people and to lead in complex systems. And the last time I came to speak to this community, I did some presentation on adaptive challenges, and I introduced some tools on how to hold really complex systems when you're trying to do change initiatives in complex systems. But today the shift is towards the self-leadership. And I know I'm following up Sarah Clearwater from CX Collective, who spoke, I think, in last month, I believe, where she started to introduce this idea that leadership is something that exists beyond the functional role within an organization, that leadership is a way of being and we all have access to it in ourselves, and exploring this idea of ecologies of leadership, where leadership as a way of being is happening within us and in the spaces between us all the time, working inside of organizations and systems. So that's a little bit of an intro, and I kind of want to pause before I throw a few more slides at you and continue to talk, to kind of model one of the practices that I think is part of self-leadership and is connected to self-awareness and self-regulation. So I'm just going to invite everyone to slow down, take a breath, feel your feet on the floor. We're just going to do a very brief mindfulness practice to remind ourselves of what's arising inside of us as we're here listening and engaging with the content today. So feeling our feet on the floor, feeling the back of the chair supporting our frame, and the seat of the chair supporting our whole body, holding us up against the force of gravity, and allowing our bodies just to rest into the chair that is holding us. And breathing in and breathing out. And then just taking our heads, and we're going to just look over our right shoulder and feel the stretch in our neck. And then the same on the other side, looking over our left shoulder. And coming back to the center. And this time we're going to twist our legs to the left, but our head to the right. So a little bit of a twist. And the same thing in the other direction. So what we're doing is we're stretching the polyvagus nerve, which comes down the face, down through the chest, and also down the back of the spine and down the back. So we're just stretching the nervous system that helps us regulate our emotional state. And then we're breathing in again and breathing out. And working with our breath, just pulling our breath from the floor through the bottom of our feet, up our legs, through our torso to the top of our head, and on the exhale, back down to the ground again. Just a few breaths. And with our breath, just slowing down enough to notice what's arising as sensation in the body. Nothing to do, just to be present for it. And when you're ready to open your eyes, and we'd like to invite you to just pop into the chat the response to the question after sitting with your body in this way. What's the outer weather and what's the inner weather where you're located right now? Literally, what is the weather outside and what's the inner weather? What's going on inside of you that you'd like to name? And just pop that response in the chat. I think Sarah has put the question in the chat to help prompt everyone as well.
I can go ahead and share my inner weather. It's a bit cloudy and stormy on a Thursday, personally. And then my outside weather, I'm in Wellington, and I think the sun's trying to break through the clouds, but not wholly succeeding.
Beautiful. Anybody else? Just take a moment.
Pisa shared in the chat that they love this question and that it helps within the mental health sector, which I think is also very true. And I appreciate the mindful moment. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, we'll keep moving. And I just want to frame up for you all what I think I'd like to discuss today, or what the focus of today is, so that we can be prepared. I want to take a moment to really talk about, what we mean by self-leadership. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So just for this conversation, how am I defining that? So I want to provide that for everybody. And then I just want to speak very briefly about the conditions we are responding to when we need to lead ourselves in the world as it is right now. And then we'll spend a little time looking at what are some leverage points for change, and how that connects to self-leadership, our ability to change and adapt. And then I want to spend quite a bit of time introducing a practice that helps close the gap between what we say we want and what we actually do. And so this is kind of linked back to the element of self-leadership that has to do with our self-awareness and our intentions. So that's where we're heading. And we'll just start with this inquiry around what I mean by self-leadership. So I want to flag this because I know, as I said, Sarah Clearwater was here and she was talking about the difference between leadership as a functional role and then leadership as a way of being and what that could mean. And I just want to flag that when we talk about leadership, we're often talking about it across three different scales. Today, we're really focusing on this scale of the I. I am a system in and of myself. How do I lead myself as a human system through the world in my professional and personal context? And what does that look like and what does that entail? But there's also the dimension of, well, what happens in the relational space, in the we space? What does leading with look and feel like? And what capacities are required of us in order to do that with a degree of mastery? And then there's this dimension of leading systems or large-scale organizations. What is it about being in the functional role, but also inside of an organization as an individual with agency that enables me to lead the system that I'm engaging with, and thinking systemically about decision-making and how a whole organization responds to challenge and complexity. So there are these different scales of engaging with leadership that extend beyond just the functional role. And today we're just really zooming in on this individual scale. And the reason why is something that I think is worth understanding. Now, as I said before, this notion of self-leadership could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I've just grabbed something that was meaningful to me, and it's some quotes from an article about Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor during World War II, and he's often considered quite an icon in terms of his own self-leadership in the face of highly volatile, uncertain, and horrific conditions. And he's quite admired, and he writes about it in Man's Search for Meaning. And you could say he's kind of part of the sort of humanistic and existential movements which really came to the fore in the mid-20th century. But these quotes are really helpful in understanding what I mean. So the first, leading oneself intrinsically, proactively, and regardless of external circumstance. And what they said about Viktor Frankl was that he had a profound understanding that he could not change what was happening to him and his fellow inmates, but he could choose how to respond to it. So I've just grabbed a little bit of a frame to the left here, which I think is helpful for our conversation today, that these three dimensions of self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-motivation come together to form a methodology or an understanding of how to cultivate self-leadership. And there's lots of research and literature on this topic, and I'm not going to really go into all that so much. I just want to flag, as I said, what I mean by self-leadership. And when we talk about self-awareness, it's really making visible that which we cannot see about ourselves and about how we're making meaning of and in relationship with the world around us. And when it comes to self-regulation, we're talking about the ability to emotionally regulate our own nervous systems, to soothe our own unmet needs, to be mindful of our own reactivity, to understand what our triggers are, and to be able to return to a regulated, calm state in the face of challenge. And self-motivation, what I mean around that is around intent. We have vision and intent and the vectors we set in our lives for what we want to achieve and accomplish, and our capacity to make that manifest through the journey of self-leadership is part of this bigger story. So we only have a short amount of time. So today my focus is on the self-awareness domain, even though we did a little bit of self-regulation in the opening of our session today with our meditation practice. So I just want to speak a little bit to, now that we understand what I mean by self-leadership, I want to talk to the context and the conditions that we are needing to lead ourselves in. And systems and groups and collections of people, the we and the it, are having to navigate this time of transition, as well as us as individuals. And of course, we are nested inside of those other planes of leadership. But in terms of understanding the space we're having to lead ourselves through, I call it this time of transition, and I define it as a time when we're feeling the pull of the future, the push of the present, and the drag of the past simultaneously, and in a way that is generating unprecedented disruption inside of us, around us, through us, in every way. And I would argue that it has to do with the convergence of three transformative forces: an economic force, which is often referred to as the Fourth Industrial Revolution; an ecological force, sometimes referred to as the Anthropocene; and a cultural force. So I'll just speak briefly to each of these things. The first force kind of brings together the tensions inherent in artificial intelligence combined with robotics, and how that's disrupting self-identity, how we relate to work, what jobs of the future might be, who we are, how we construct our identity around the work and roles we play in our professional contexts. Also, shifting global demographics and how people are moving and migrating around the planet, and the resilience that has the potential to create, and the brittleness that has the potential to create when institutions aren't prepared to adapt and welcome that quality of diversity. And then also this idea of platform technologies that are trading value without an intermediary determining what that value is, and how that has disrupted business models and revenue models from the solopreneur all the way up to large organizations and global companies. So there's a lot of disruption going on in our economic sphere that's having, of course, impacts on mental health and on our socially constructed systems and our environment, which brings us to the ecological force. Anthropocene, anthr meaning human, pocene referring to a chunk of geologic time. We're in a time right now where it's being called the Anthropocene, having come out of the Holocene, which the Holocene ended when the last ice sheets, the Holocene began when the last ice sheets receded from the northern hemisphere. And we're shifting into the Anthropocene because human behavior is impacting the biospheric structure of the planet in ways we haven't seen before. And of course, our changing climate, mass extinction, pandemics, floods, it's all happening to us. We're kind of living into this reality right now, and it's highly disruptive. And then this sort of cultural force where we're feeling a tension between a reductionist way of seeing the world versus a pluralistic way of seeing the world. A reductionist way of seeing the world is very if-then logic, very linear. We often refer to a singular narrative about the unfolding history of humankind, and it's very Anglo-European focused. Versus a pluralistic way of seeing the world, that there are many stories, many perspectives, all matter, all need to be included, all are a part of the developing story of humanity. And I just have pictures here of 1969 lunar landing, where everybody's in a public space watching one TV screen about, and one broadcaster talking about what's happening on the moon, versus today, where we're all in our own little vicious cycles, feeding ourselves the information we want to read and reinforcing perhaps our core assumptions about the way we think the world is. So there's a tension between those two paradigms, and neither on their own are sufficient to meet the challenge that the economic and ecological forces bring to bear for humanity and for life on planet Earth. So we're living in really disrupted times, and the impact of all this is it's enhancing and amplifying the volatility we're facing. So these challenges are more unexpected, unstable, things are speeding up, change is rapid and iterative, things are uncertain, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. You can't rely on the past to determine what's going to happen in the future. There's a level of complexity here where multiple events are converging and issues are coming together, and we can't actually pinpoint direct cause and effect relationships between them. And this piece around ambiguity, where multiple interpretations are open and ever present and co-arising, and there's no clear way to make meaning of events. So I'm arguing that in this world, we, leading ourselves, need to understand the conditions we're operating in and start to prepare ourselves for being able to change and shift and find a locus of control when so many things around us are beyond our control. Finding a locus of control becomes a key to our own self-leadership, and we need to be able to change our interior world in order to adapt to the exterior conditions. And I would also argue that the secret to change is understanding, why it's so hard and our resistance to change. And I just bring this this last little picture up here for us because it's from the work of Suhail Inayatollah. It's causal layered analysis, and those of you who might be more familiar with a large-scale systems change or service design or futures thinking may have seen this before. But I think it's a great metaphor when it comes to realizing that we need to adapt, we need to change, we need to make the locus of control connected to our interiority. And so I want to show you this image of an iceberg, and to explain it in terms of these distinctions as we go down lower against the waterline. At the high water mark, above the waterline, we've got like our complaints, our problems, our symptoms, the litany of issues and sort of news headlines that we're telling ourselves about what's happening to us. And that might be related to your workmates. It might be related to restructures in organizations. It might be related to concerns, financial concerns, or being forced to leave a job. There could be a whole different litany of issues that are impacting what's arising inside of us as an individual right now. Then if you go below the waterline, we're starting to look at things like systemic causes, like what's happening in the global economy, what's happening with supply chains, what's happening with the war in Ukraine, what's impacting inflation, what's happening in this sort of post-pandemic context that's affecting us as individuals that we're interacting with in our exterior world. What are the systemic causes for the complaints or the symptoms that I'm experiencing? And then down another level, it's like, okay, below the waterline and below the phytoplankton, deep sea, ocean here, we're looking at our core assumptions about what we think is true, our opinions, our viewpoints, our core beliefs, things that we might not actually be visible to us. That's why they're sitting really in the deep sea. We can't really see them. It's hard to access them. They're not front of mind. They're not accessible to us like the litany is. And even deeper, below the sand, drilling down beneath the crust of the ocean, is where our subconscious collective stories, our grand narratives about the world and how we see the world. They're living in this sort of deep place that is very difficult for us to access. And so I would argue that taking the time to have a look at the stories we're telling ourselves about what we think is true about the world and starting to examine our core assumptions is a very high leverage point to becoming adaptive and flexible and to ease the resistance we have to change, to make our wanting to really hang on to how things are a little bit more relaxed. So I think what I'd like to do is introduce this idea of how the stories we tell ourselves about what we think is true about who we are may not be as accurate as we are led to believe. And we may have a little bit more control and accessibility around the stories and the core assumptions driving those stories so that we can start to imagine new stories and perhaps have those new stories inform different behavior. So I'm going to introduce a practice that helps make those stories visible. Before I do that, I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions that they want to pop in the chat, anything that you'd like me to respond to before I keep moving. Okay. So the way to surface these invisible stories is through a piece of work that was developed by Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it's called The Immunity to Change. And it's about following a few steps, following a bit of a canvas or a template that will help reveal to us the gap between what we say we want for ourselves and the story we're telling about what we say we want, and then what we're actually doing and the behaviors we're actually exhibiting in our day-to-day. Again, this practice I'm going to introduce can be applied to each of us as individuals. It can be applied to us working in teams. It can also be applied at the scale of the whole organization. But because we're focused on self-leadership, we're focusing on self-awareness around self-leadership, and we're focusing on this high leverage point around being able to be flexible, to change and be adaptive. We're looking at what are the stories we're telling ourselves that might inhibit us from being able to step into a new story, a new narrative that can drive our direction toward what we say we want for ourselves. And we have to start to understand, and this practice will reveal it, is that we may say very consciously we want one thing, but there's often something else that we're committed to, that we can't see, that is invisible to us, that we don't have awareness of, that all of our behaviors are actually aligning to. And so this practice is about revealing that. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, because before we look at what I have on the Post-it notes, I want to explain the method a little bit first, and then we'll hone in, and I'm providing a case study here. So this map takes us through, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different columns. So I'm just going to explain the canvas. In the first column, we ask ourselves the question, what is it that we want? What is it that we want to have be different? What's our, call it an improvement goal, or call it an objective, or a desire that we want for ourselves? What is it that we're longing for, that we want to have be different? And if you remember in that first image, it was self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-motivation. So this is the piece around, like, we have an intent, we have something we want to manifest for ourselves. And again, just a reminder, we're doing the practice of self-leadership for our own leadership, but in service to the bigger picture, because the world is in this state of flux. We need to have as many of us with the capacity to self-lead, so that we can take that next step and start to lead with others and respond wisely to the complexity that we're facing. So yes, we want to lead the self, but by doing that, we're actually getting ourselves prepared to lead with others and to lead large, complex systems as well. So what is it that we want for ourselves? And then in this column here, we start to ask the questions, what behaviors do we know that if we do those behaviors, it'll connect us, it'll lead us, it'll take us to achieving this goal? If we did these behaviors, this will inevitably just manifest, because we know these are connected and linked. There's a cause and effect relationship between these behaviors and this goal. Then in column 2, we start to surface and play with, okay, well, what are we actually doing? What are the behaviors we are doing that go against this goal, that are counter to this goal, that constrain this goal from happening? And it's important to take the time to really look at what we're doing and connecting it back with our intention. Because oftentimes it's a bit like if anybody's wanting to get really fit. I want to reach this fitness goal in this amount of time, and trying to figure out, well, why can't I get there? Because most of us know what we need to do. That's not what's blocking our behavior from aligning with the outcome we want. There's something going on that's secret to us, that's hidden from us, that we're more committed to than this outcome or objective we say we're committed to. So it's important to first surface, well, what are the behaviors we know will connect, and what are the behaviors that we know will constrain? So the second column is identifying, well, what am I actually doing that I know is going against that goal? And then in the third column, we start to explore, and this is a little bit tricky. We start to explore, what are the fears? What's the worst thing that's going to happen to me if I stop doing the behaviors that I know won't give me this outcome? So I need you to kind of like really listen to that carefully. What's the worst thing that's going to happen to me if I stop doing the behaviors that I know won't give me this outcome? Not if I stop doing the behaviors that I think will. If I stop doing the behaviors that I think will not give me that outcome. And that's what we call our worry box, worst case scenario. What are we so afraid of? And when we start to cluster some of these worst case scenarios together, we start to surface what we call, or what Keegan and Leahy call, the competing commitment, the hidden commitment, the thing we're more committed to than what we say we're committed to in this column. And then in the fourth column, it's the big assumption, or the big core assumption, that is sitting beneath these worst fears. It's this core belief that we think is true about ourselves and the world, that has got us locked in place. And so we want to surface that, because when you look at these different core assumptions, you start to see the story. You start to see the narrative. You start to see the deep unconscious story that's driving what Keegan and Leahy would call our resistance to change. It's making us stuck with the gas on and the brake on at the same time, the accelerator and the brake on at the same time. So it locks energy. It makes us brittle. It makes us less able to flex, because there's something we're more committed to that's invisible to us. And we can't understand, but I want this. Why can't I want this change. I want this new direction. I want this, this evolving sense of self. Why can't I manifest that? So moving through this template is a process of revealing that to ourselves. So I'm going to zoom in now, and I'm going to walk us through a case study of a client that I've coached around their own leadership and around their own self-leadership. And the client had done a 360 assessment report called the Leadership Circle Profile, and had received feedback around an area of their own leadership, a category of their own leadership, that if they could enhance, could improve their effectiveness in their functional role. So I'm going to zoom in. And before I do, are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions or concerns? Anything they need clarified? It's a quiet bunch. Okay, shall I keep going, Sarah, then?
I think so. I think everyone's just taking it in and keen to see the case study and how they might apply that to their own roles. But no, I'm in it. I'm here.
Okay, great. It's just good to get feedback as I go, so I know what's happening. So let's run this case study. I'm zooming in. In the first column, the client basically identified that they would like to be a more decisive leader. They identified decisiveness as taking action, making faster decisions, following through on their decisions, and they had very clear behaviors that they know would connect them personally with being more decisive. The first was to trust my instincts. So I'm speaking in the first person. The client wrote, to trust my instincts, to make decisions faster, to communicate without censoring what I'm going to say. Okay, and the next question. So those are the behaviors that you know will produce being a more decisive leader. What are the behaviors that actually go against that the client was enacting? So she said, I ask everyone for their opinion. I explore every possibility before returning to my first thoughts. I let people sway me who I think know more than me. I speak in tangents. I decide and then spend days second guessing my decision. So those are very clear behaviors. And also, it's important when you're running this process on yourself to really make the behaviors concrete, to sort of get out of the conceptual space and go, what do I actually do and what do I actually not do? And really sort of, write it out and lay it out and get it clear for yourself so that it's what I would say concrete. So then the next question was, okay, if you stopped asking everyone for their opinion, if you stopped exploring every possibility before returning to your first thought, if you stopped speaking in tangents, if you stopped spending days second guessing your decision, what's the worst thing that would happen? And so she said, well, if I stopped asking everyone for their opinion and I stopped letting people sway me who I think know more than me, I'm afraid I'll be held responsible when something goes wrong. I'm afraid I'll make the wrong decision. I'm afraid people won't like me. I'm afraid I'll mess everything and everyone else up. I'm afraid I'll do harm. So all these behaviors that she knows aren't going to produce the result that she wants, she's afraid to stop doing them because if she keeps doing them, she thinks these things will happen. And so I'm going to zoom out here because what we're starting to see is a cluster of what these hidden fears kind of, if you look at them together, and I'm hoping everyone can still see these. And I want you to look at this list below. We're trying to identify a competing commitment, the thing that the client's more committed to than becoming a decisive leader. And if you look at some of these things down here, there are 5 different competing commitments that, like, when you contextualize them, they tend to sit in these 5 different categories. I'm more committed to making myself look good. I'm more committed to avoiding embarrassment or blame. I'm more committed to affirming my image of myself. I'm more committed to being liked, and I'm more committed to staying in my comfort zone. Now, these are all perfectly legitimate. Like, why wouldn't you be committed to these things, right? There's nothing, it's kind of neutral. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you look at the cluster of what's written above, I'd like to see, you could either speak if you want to, or you can pop in the chat. Where do you see some of these worst fears clustering around? Which of these competing commitment themes start to emerge, do you think? Right. Avoiding blame and being liked, ensuring being liked theme, yeah. Ensuring being liked, self-identity, yeah. Staying in my comfort zone. I ran this process on myself the other day, and I was shocked. You can run it across a whole bunch of different desired future outcomes you want for yourself. Like, it's not always going to be the same thing that you land on. We're running lots of stories about what we think are true. And I did this with myself the other day, and I landed on the, wow, I am just so in my comfort zone. I do not want to get out of I'm so committed to being in my comfort zone. And that's not something I usually notice about myself, but it was hardcore. So it's very interesting to see what we're committed to. I love it. So there's a little bit of everything. So I'm going to pop over here now and say, what's the big assumption that's sitting underneath the worry box and the core assumption around, trying to avoid blame and trying to stay liked, right? And if I keep, as she was saying, because what it came down to for her was she was avoiding being blamed, and she was wanting to make sure she was being liked. Because her big assumption is if she gets it wrong and she gets blamed for something, it means she's a bad person. That's what she's got running in her head. If I'm wrong and blamed, it means I'm bad. And the other thing she has running in her head is everything's my responsibility. I'm responsible for everything that happens. So in a way, there's something there around her self-identity or her image of herself. I'm responsible for everything that happens. So there's a story, a deep-seated narrative running below the seabed around, if I get it wrong, I'm responsible for everything that happens to everybody. And when I get it wrong, it means I'm bad. Now, she could then go and do some work, and we did in the coaching session. Well, what is this? Where is this coming from? Like, where is this I'm bad if I get it wrong? And we started to unpack that a little bit. And that kind of bleeds more into the coaching sort of psychotherapeutic dimension. And I know that's not the context for today. But it was basically a story that emerged when she was quite young, where she had, very authoritarian parents, and there was a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And if she didn't get it right, it meant something about herself. So she's so terrified about making a wrong decision because it has so much weight, rather than it just being a wrong decision that can be reversed, or that decisions are collective and sometimes she can share responsibility with those decisions. So there's a whole new narrative that can be developed that goes against the one she's been telling herself since she was quite small about what it means to be decisive. And I'm just introducing this to you because now this person, she doesn't need to go off and do anything differently. The work for her is to go and experiment and start observing. Every time she gets this feeling like she wants to be decisive, but she's doing these behaviors, she has to pause and go, oh, I'm doing this. What is my competing commitment that I'm avoiding feeling? And paying attention to the story that's running that. And that's the only work she has to do, is to just start observing in all of her interactions when this story is starting to drive her behavior. Because when she's doing these things, she's more committed to what's happening here than she is to this. And she's doing these things because she believes this to be true. And if I said to her, are you 100% certain that this is true? Even if it's 99.9% certain it's true, because she feels like it's really true, there's always a little place in ourselves that know that there's another possible story to tell. You know, there could be another path forward. And so in the coaching space, and in the transition leadership program that I run, we uncover some of that and unpackage some of that for people so that they can start to tell a new story about how they can make meaning of the world around them that will start informing a different set of behavior. But the first step is to just observe it. And the second step is to run really simple, safe to fail experiments. What if you did a different behavior? What if you questioned getting it wrong meant I'm bad, and you restructure that narrative? Well, getting it wrong just meant I got it wrong that time. It doesn't mean I'm bad. How will that impact my behavior? And running a few experiments. So she did do that. The next time she started exhibiting these behaviors, she realized what she was avoiding feeling. And she said to herself, well, actually getting it wrong doesn't mean I'm bad. It just means I'm getting it wrong. So let's make a simple decision quickly that maybe there isn't a lot at stake and see what happens, so that she could start to build a body of evidence to support a new narrative about what could be true.